Imagine the perfect vacation. What comes to mind? Is it the intoxicating aroma of freshly baked croissants wafting from a quaint Parisian cafe as you watch the world go by on a cobblestone street? Or perhaps you're more drawn to the thrill of diving into the crystal-clear turquoise waters of Tahiti, exploring a vibrant underwater world teeming with exotic marine life. Maybe it's the exhilarating challenge of scaling the snowy peaks of the Swiss Alps, feeling the rush of icy wind against your face as you ascend higher and higher. Or could it be the simple joy of immersing yourself in the vibrant bustling markets of Marrakesh, haggling over treasures and trinkets in a whirl of colors and sounds? These are not mere figments of your imagination, but real, tangible experiences waiting to be discovered. We're about to embark on a whirlwind tour of the top 25 most epic destinations on the planet. Well, guess what? It's not just a dream. Welcome to the world's most delicious destinations. Imagine yourself in the heart of Bangkok, surrounded by the intoxicating aroma of sizzling street food. From the spicy tang of pad thai noodles cooked fresh on the spot, to the sweet allure of mango sticky rice, every bite is a culinary adventure. The city's food stalls are a symphony of flavor, where the simple act of eating becomes an experience to savor. Now let's jet off to Rome, the capital of all things delicious. Here, the dining experience is elevated to an art form. Picture yourself in a Michelin-starred restaurant indulging in a plate of fettuccine alfredo, the pasta cooked to perfection and the sauce a creamy, cheesy heaven. Follow this with a scoop of gelato, its cool sweetness the perfect end to a meal that's nothing short of a masterpiece. And then, there's Marrakesh, a vibrant city that teases the senses with its colorful array of spices and flavors. Navigate the labyrinthine streets of the Medina, where the air is heavy with the scent of cumin, turmeric, and cinnamon. Pull up a stool at a bustling market stall and try a tagine, a slow-cooked stew that's the epitome of Moroccan cuisine. The tender meat, the fragrant spices, and the hearty vegetables meld together in a dish that's as warm and welcoming as the city itself. But these are just a taste of the world's culinary delights. From the sushi masters of Tokyo to the barbecue pits of Texas, every destination offers its own unique flavors, its own gastronomic journey. Whether you're a seasoned foodie or just someone who loves a good meal, the world is a buffet, waiting for you to dig in. So, get ready to embark on a culinary journey like no other, where every meal tells a story, every dish is a celebration, and every bite is a revelation. From the exotic to the familiar, the spicy to the sweet, the world's cuisine is a feast for the senses, a delight for the palate, and an experience that's truly unforgettable. Your taste buds will be forever grateful. Sun, sand, and crystal-clear waters await. Picture this: Bora Bora, a gem in the South Pacific, where the beaches are so pristine, they seem to have been painted by a master artist. The sand is as fine as powdered sugar, a brilliant white against the turquoise waves that gently lap the shore. Palm trees sway in the balmy breeze, their shadows dancing on the sun-drenched sand. It's a place where time seems to stand still, a haven for those seeking pure, unadulterated relaxation. Now let's surf our way to Bali, the Indonesian island that's a paradise for wave riders and sunseekers alike. Here the beaches are not just beautiful, they're also brimming with adrenaline-pumping action. Whether you're a seasoned surfer or a curious newbie, there's a wave with your name on it. And after a hard day's surfing, there's nothing like kicking back with a refreshing cocktail, watching as the sun paints the sky with hues of orange, pink, and purple. But the beach bliss doesn't stop there. Let's wing our way to the Seychelles, an archipelago of 115 islands scattered like jewels across the Indian Ocean. These islands are home to some of the most breathtaking beaches on the planet, with enormous granite boulders framing the picture-perfect scenes. Imagine dipping your toes in the warm azure waters, your worries melting away with each gentle wave. The beaches here are so tranquil, so undisturbed, you might even forget about the outside world for a while. These beach destinations offer more than just stunning landscapes. They offer a sense of peace, a chance to disconnect from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. They offer the simple pleasures of feeling the sun on your skin, the sand beneath your feet, and the soothing rhythm of the waves. It's about immersing yourself in the beauty of nature, letting the serene surroundings work their magic on your soul. So whether you're an adventure junkie, a sun worshipper, or simply a lover of beautiful places, these beach destinations are sure to leave a lasting imprint on your heart. You can already feel the sand between your toes, can't you? Craving for some luxury? Well, who isn't? Now let's embark on a journey to discover some of the world's most luxurious destinations that redefine opulence and indulge your senses in the most extraordinary ways. First stop, the Maldives, an archipelago of dreams where luxury is reimagined. Here you'll find resorts that are more than just accommodations, they're private islands of paradise. Imagine waking up in a villa hovering over crystal-clear waters, sipping champagne as you watch the sun paint the sky in shades of gold. From private butlers to personal chefs, every whim becomes a command. It's a place where the line between dreams and reality blurs, creating a realm of unparalleled luxury. Next, let's take a romantic detour to the cliff-perched hideaways of Santorini. This Greek island is a symphony of white and blue, where every corner tells a story of love and luxury. Picture yourself in a private suite overlooking the azure Aegean Sea, with a plunge pool set against the backdrop of the island's iconic caldera. Santorini's luxury is about more than just the physical, it's about capturing moments that make time stand still. Finally, we land in Bali, the island of gods, known equally for its spiritual serenity and luxurious spas. Imagine surrendering to the hands of expert therapists in a spa nestled amidst lush tropical greenery, with the sound of a gurgling stream soothing your senses. Every treatment is a celebration of nature's bounty, designed to rejuvenate and restore your inner balance. In these destinations, luxury is not just about materialistic extravagance. It's about creating an experience that stays with you long after you've returned to the humdrum of everyday life. It's about feeling special, cherished, and most importantly, pampered in every possible way. So whether you're a fan of the Maldivian opulence, the romantic charm of Santorini, or the holistic luxury of Bali, there's a place that's waiting to spoil you rotten. Luxury, after all, is the ultimate vacation treat. Get ready to dive into the past, with every footstep echoing through time, history buffs. This is your moment to rejoice. Our journey begins in the heart of Rome, at the Colosseum. Built nearly 2,000 years ago, this massive amphitheater once roared with the cheers of 50,000 spectators. Imagine the clash of gladiators, the drama of theatrical performances, and the grandeur of Roman architecture. This is not just a monument, it's a testament to the splendor of a bygone era. Next, we journey east to the awe-inspiring temples of Angkor Wat in Cambodia. As the sun peaks over the horizon, the world's largest religious monument stands majestically, its intricate carvings illuminated in the morning light. With a history dating back to the 12th century, Angkor Wat tells a story of devotion, grandeur, and the rise and fall of empires. As you wander through these ancient hallways, you're walking in the footsteps of Khmer kings, experiencing a slice of history that's as fascinating as it is humbling. Our final destination is the Great Wall of China. Stretching over 13,000 miles, this colossal fortification is a marvel of human determination and perseverance. Built over centuries, the Great Wall protected ancient Chinese empires from invaders and became a symbol of national pride. As you traverse its winding path, you're not just seeing a wall, you're witnessing a tapestry of history unfold, etched in every stone. History is not merely a collection of dates and events. It's a vibrant tapestry woven with stories of human triumphs, tragedies, hopes, and dreams. And these destinations are the threads that make this tapestry so captivating. So whether you're standing in the shadow of the Colosseum, wandering through the corridors of Angkor Wat, or walking along the Great Wall, you're not just visiting a tourist attraction, you're stepping into a time machine, experiencing a world that has shaped ours. History has never been this exciting. For those who crave adrenaline and raw beauty, we've got just the ticket. Imagine standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon, where sheer cliffs plunge into a chasm of red rock that stretches as far as the eye can see. The wind whispers tales of ancient rivers carving their paths over millions of years. Here, adventure means strapping on your hiking boots and descending into the heart of the canyon, navigating switchbacks and challenging trails, with every step revealing a new perspective of this natural wonder. Now, let's swap the arid desert for the underwater wonderland of the Great Barrier Reef. As you plunge into the warm, clear waters, your senses are awakened by the vibrant colors and curious creatures that call this reef home. From the tiniest technicolor fish to the grandeur of migrating whales, snorkeling here is a dance with Mother Nature herself, a chance to experience the pulsating life that thrives beneath the waves. Finally, let's journey to the Amazon rainforest, where the air is heavy with the scent of damp earth and the hum of unseen creatures. Here, the adventure is less about conquering and more about immersion. Picture yourself in a kayak, gliding through the dense emerald canopy, the only sounds being the dip of your paddle and the distant calls of exotic birds. This is not just a physical journey but a voyage into the heart of the planet itself. These are just a few of the adrenaline-fueled escapades that our beautiful world has to offer. Whether it's standing at the precipice of the Grand Canyon, swimming alongside the marine life of the Great Barrier Reef, or navigating the lush waterways of the Amazon, adventure is more than just a thrill. It's the feeling of being alive, of pushing boundaries, and of truly experiencing the raw, untamed beauty of our planet. So, for those with a taste for the extreme, for the wanderers and thrill seekers, remember, adventure is out there waiting for you. So, what are you waiting for? The world is a magnificent canvas, filled with endless possibilities. It's a symphony of cultures, landscapes, cuisines, and adventures just waiting to be explored. And guess what? This video is your VIP ticket to embark on that journey, a journey that will make your wildest dreams come true. Think about it. You could be sipping a cappuccino at a quaint cafe in Rome, soaking up the sun on a pristine beach in Bora Bora, or standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon, awestruck by its sheer majesty. These aren't just fantasies, they're real experiences, waiting for you to dive in and make them your own. But as we all know, every epic journey starts with a single step, and that first step is planning. Sure, it can seem daunting, but that's where we come in. This video is your ultimate travel guide, your personal concierge, if you will. It's packed with insider tips, stunning destinations, and the kind of travel inspiration that sets hearts racing. So let's make your dream vacation a reality. Use this video as your guide, your roadmap to the world's most epic destinations. And while you're at it, why not share the excitement? Share this video with your fellow travel enthusiasts. Spread the inspiration. After all, experiences are so much better when shared, right? And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Why, you ask? Because this is just the beginning. We've got a whole world to explore together, and trust us, you won't want to miss a single moment. From the sun-kissed beaches of Bali to the ancient wonders of Egypt, we'll be uncovering destinations that will leave you breathless. Pack your bags, grab your camera, and get ready to be amazed, because the world is out there waiting for you. And we're here, ready to guide you every step of the way. The journey starts now. So, let's go.